I'm Nat. This is Exceptional Individuals, and we are doing a webinar on ADHD and discrimination. It's all about when things go wrong, looking at what are the potential outcomes. I'm not a lawyer. Don't take legal advice off of me. You'll go to jail or something. It's not a good idea. But I am going to be looking at some interesting tribunals where things have worked out in people's favor, and when they haven't worked out in their favor, typically it comes down to should you disclose, should you not disclose, when you disclosed, and how much of a deficit equals a disability. A little bit ADHD doesn't count. If I have severe ADHD, and then are those words even applicable? Those are some of the things we're going to be looking at today. We are mainly focusing on ADHD today in terms of the examples and the particular cases, but we are going to show you how sometimes it's not as black and white as you'd like to think. We work with people all the time who are going through tribunals, disciplinaries, feel discriminated against. While we can't give them direct advice, we can definitely tell them about prior examples and how they went and give them maybe a few tips into the right direction. Now, as today, we've got me, we've got April, we've got Jess, but let's get on to the meat of it. ADHD discrimination. It's always good to start off with a bit of a definition on what we're on about. Let's look at ADD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It is an official diagnosis in all reputable diagnostic manuals. Predominantly 2013 is when it got, it's been updated throughout the years. It's an evolving diagnosis. However, while it's an interesting one because there aren't any concrete biological markers to say what ADHD is and what it isn't, it is one of the most widely diagnosed conditions around, full stop. People have it. If people have it, it can be discriminated against. That's what we're going to be looking at. Sometimes it's the attention angle or the lack of attention. It could be the hyperactivity or the hyperfocus or the inattention. In terms of how it impacts you, it can look very different for different people. And here lies part of the issue. The diagnosis is kind of too broad to the point where no one really knows what it is. And because no one knows what it is, it makes it very easy to put your foot in it as an employer or to get discriminated against. And for someone to say, I didn't know about this. Now, ignorance is never going to be a good enough reason for someone to be discriminated against. However, it is something that is going to be done time and time again. Now, let's look off, how prevalent is ADHD? Now, again, every time I show you stats, they're always changing. I get them from different places just to keep you on your feet. But more or less, it is the worldwide stats. Now, if you're like, Nat, how did you get the whole world to come together in unity and come up with real legit stats? We didn't. What we did is we got lots of different papers from all over the world, and then we took the average. It's not a foolproof mechanism, but it does the job. It gives you an idea. Before I do, is it 1% or 100%? And it'll be like, oh, easy answer. Be making it a little bit more difficult just to keep it interesting. They are all correct. But here's the thing. Our stats are dodge. They are very inaccurate. Let's break it down. 2.5 is correct because that is the lower amount for adults with ADHD worldwide. Then we got 4%. That is the higher end of adults with ADHD worldwide. Now, why do adults have less likely to have ADHD than children? Comes down to how we diagnose people. Remember, ADHD is not a neuroscience. It is a psychology. It's what we observe. Adults, we observe less. Then let's move it up to 5%. That is the lower estimate for children. And 7%, you guessed it, is the higher amount for children. Either way, it's really prevalent. It doesn't go away in adulthood, but it does present differently. Typically, the hyperactivity kind of shifts and gravitates into inattentiveness, restlessness, and this is one of the reasons why not everyone picks up upon it. What about certain demographics, male or female? If males are more likely, can you still have ADHD be discriminated as a woman? Yes, you can. But the reason why is when we think of ADHD, we are thinking of the way it represents in males. So employers who aren't meant to be experts in any of these conditions, you can't ask everyone to know everything. They are naturally going to have a less of an understanding and awareness in women than they do males. Does this kind of let them off the hook a little bit? Ah, yes, Christine, no option for equal. They are equal, or at least we assume they are equal. In terms of the real answer, maybe we are looking at equal. Here it comes down to a bunch of factors: environmental and neurotrauma. Essentially, what happened in your environment, your neighborhood, your economic, social background, all of that lovely stuff. Also, head injuries. Believe it or not, that can contribute. I don't want us to get all fixated on it because, like, it doesn't have to. But when we say neurotrauma, it could just be in birth, rattling about a little bit, or it could be lots of tiny things. But what plays a much, much bigger role is genetics. This could be neurochemical changes, a little bit of dopamine, a little less dopamine, a bit more estrogen. It's just all the chemicals like varying in the brain. Quite often from a young age, you get an influx of one, and that can change your neurochemistry for life. And then we've also got chromosomal changes. Essentially, our DNA is made up lots of little bits and bobs. And when they change, it can increase the likelihood of ADHD. Now, because males and females are different, they do change differently. But if you'll notice, a lot of these are things that aren't really impacted by gender, or as far as I'm aware. The reason why ADHD portrays differently is, one, there is a chemical element to it, but probably the bigger element is just social expectations of what we're looking for. It's probably because they're more likely to be discriminated against because it's our understanding. April says, although I have autism rather than ADHD, I feel victimized for disability discrimination recently, where I was initially sent off the megabus, just went from London, Victoria to Newport, South Wales. I accidentally knocked my handbag into another passenger as I boarded the coach. The driver sent me off because he's labelled me that I got kicked off because I looked angry. I was annoyed by something else at the time. He was concerned about me upsetting other passengers. I explained my diagnosis to the driver and said certain remarks upset me. I was allowed to board as long as I was away from the said passenger. When I contacted Megabus about what happened, I wasn't happy with their response. Honestly, April, that's horrible. It's interesting because what you said there was in their right until you mentioned your diagnosis. And then for that point, there should have been some understanding. Again, it isn't up for the Megabus to be an expert in autism, but they should at least have a basic understanding that some things can make things more different. I also know that you often typically have your lanyard or something around there, which shouldn't be needed, but can be helpful. Oh, great. Do you know what, Emma? We can't blame the mum for everything, but yeah, it's complicated where ADHD comes from. But that's neither there or there for employers. It's none of their business to know what happened. Here's the question. Can you stop having ADHD? So yeah, the answer is no, you can't. You are born with ADHD, you die with ADHD, it's part of your DNA, it's who you are. However, there are a very few instances where ADHD has vanished. Personally, I think that's because maybe the person was wrongly diagnosed in the beginning, but just it's never really a clear-cut answer. So yeah, I would say 9 times out of 10, if not 99.9%, no, you can't. ADHD is for life. There have been some cases in tribunals where people say, you weren't disabled at the time X incident happened. For instance, something will happen. There'll be a disagreement, a tribunal, some legal issues, and then someone will get a diagnosis and say, see, I told you, but then the employer will be like, you weren't XYZ at that time. Now, obviously, if you get a diagnosis later in life with ADHD, you've always had ADHD. Can you retrospectively go back and say, wait a sec? Oh, it says I did have my land job at the time, but I feel like I could have shown it to the driver. You could do. I don't think you should have to, but to be honest, life's not perfect. I used to have a little card which says, attention, autistic spectrum disorder. I felt like like the FBI. I'm like, take it. James Bond has a license to kill. I have a license to offend. But yeah, I don't use that anymore. Now, which one of these are true? Select the ones which you think are most true. ADHD is a disability. Is it? Isn't it? ADHD is covered under the Older Quality Act 2010. This is for UK people. If you're outside of the UK, they're all a little bit different, but typically for most Western countries, they're about the same. Or ADHD is automatically protected under the Equality Act or disability discrimination. Yes, the alert card. Oh, they're coming in nicely. ADHD is a disability, and that's a good thing. I always say it. Officially, it's a disability. I recommend it. It's good to read. We're not mentioned in it. I'm looking at it. I'm like, dyslexia, dyspraxia, We're not in the bloody book. how are we covered? It's because we come under disability. But if it doesn't state outright, how do we know it counts? You often have to look at what is called tribunals. This is when something goes to court, it gets all written up, and you look at examples. You'd be like, oh, in the case of Jeffrey v. this has won. Neurodiversity has counted as a disability. That being said, just because it is a disability doesn't mean you personally have to resonate with it. Just know from a legal perspective, there's a difference between how you internally feel to your legal rights. It could be argued if you say, I have ADHD, I am not disabled, really outright, you could be unintentionally shooting yourself in the foot and not setting yourself up for protection later down the line. With most conditions, it's if you see someone in a wheelchair, do they need to tell you you're in a wheelchair? If you discriminate against them and they say, you never told me you were disabled, the emphasis is on the employer because it was obvious. Now, when it comes to neurodivergence, that's a grey area because if it could be saying that it was obvious, which is how do you determine that, it would be covered. If it wasn't obvious, then it is up to the person to make the employer aware. That's why I think disclosure is a good thing in the long term, even if it's not in that moment in time. ADHD is covered and ADHD is not automatically protected. This is the thing. Just because you have ADHD, because it's an invisible disability, you do have to disclose unless it's really obvious. But again, the law is often quite grey in places. But I would say best practice is if you want to protect yourself, disclosure is the way forward. However, we know discrimination is a mixed bag and you can be discriminated against for disclosure. While you could say, you discriminate against me, I'm going to sue you. Truthfully, no one wants to go down that route. It's horrible. If any of you have ever been through the court system, it is slow, it is tiring, it is exhausting, and the end result often doesn't make you feel any better. I'm not trying to put anyone off getting justice, but it's not something I would recommend for the faint of heart. We used to have loads of different ones, and then we thought, you know what? Let's stick them together. They belong together. What I want you to do, and I told you this will be a depressing webinar today, select the ones that you feel you've been discriminated against. Yay! All of these are protected characteristics. These are things which you people are not allowed to go out of their way and say, don't like you because of, or I'm not going to hire you because you're old, or you're not right for this position because you're disabled, or if you've had a gender reassignment, this isn't the workplace for you, or, oh, I don't like your shade of color. Now, obviously, protected doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means that organizations put themselves at reputation and monetary risk should they go against this. Nice in practice doesn't always work. But for instance, if someone is older, it's quite obvious they're older. If someone is physically disabled, quite obvious. With a lot of these things, it's quite obvious. But with things like ADHD, it's not obvious. That's why it's slightly different. This is where I get to read lots of horrible things about discrimination. At what stage do you disclose it? For example, I'm looking for a new job. Should I disclose it before starting, or is it okay to wait till I feel safe and comfortable enough? Do you know what? That is an individual decision. If it was me, I would wait. The reason is because the likelihood of getting discriminated early on, actually, I take that back, is quite high. But you have no idea what those people think ADHD is, all right? You can't control their understanding. They very might have an outdated negative view of it. I'd much rather get the job and then bang on straight away say adjustments are needed. Now, some people might do it right from the beginning. I think it depends on the organization, because if you had an organization that you felt that you had to hide in the shadows, are they really the organization you want to work for? But on the other hand, a lot of the people who discriminate, we like to paint them out as these villains with big mustaches and big top hats, but they're not. They're just everyday people who are a little bit ignorant. And that's why sometimes it's good to teach and educate people and then have that meaningful discussion before going straight in. I would disclose the application stage, but that's just my preference. I would argue I wouldn't want to work in a place that would discriminate immediately. Yeah, it's true. While I would never want anyone to work in a toxic workplace, I do understand that we don't all have the luxury. If it's not disclosed at the beginning, how can reasonable adjustments be put in place for the interview? That is true. You have to disclose. But A lot more organizations are allowing reasonable adjustments to happen regardless of any sort of disclosure. That is something you could look into. If you're dead against disclosure, see if they have a more of an open policy. Personally, that's more progressive and more of a future stance, but currently it's not mandatory to a certain extent. It is against the law for employers to directly ask you, are you disabled? They can't say, are you old? Are you disabled? Are you black? The person has to disclose themselves. And even if you disclose, they are then have permission to talk about it. People are scary because if they put a foot out of place, it could put them at risk. Yeah, I can see why people are a little bit jumpy. Now, a lot of the things we know that being NB isn't really that big of an issue, but what is the issue is everything else that comes along with it. For instance, if you have a disability, like if you have ADHD, maybe concentrating, maybe turning up time, maybe mental health, maybe sleep, all these other things are going to be more challenging. All right, on here, employee discrimination. I want to know which of these have you felt? We've got discrimination during recruitment. Do you feel that you've ever been discriminated against? Predominantly maybe around your brain type, but it could be anything. What about when seeking a promotion? Do you think someone has blocked you from getting it just because of your neurotype? What about during training? Do you think people haven't catered towards your needs? Or do you feel that you've been bullied as a direct result of ADHD? I think normally it's about building up a pattern or a narrative. If you can see that something has happened over a prolonged period of time, that is more what would count as discrimination rather than a one-off occurrence. Because there are procedures. You would have to say, go to HR, report it, have emails. You've always got to build up that narrative. It is something that follows you throughout your life. It's not something you can just leave at the workplace, but you do want the workplace to be a nice place. So this moves us on to reasonable adjustments. As an employer, if you want to make sure that you aren't on the wrong side of history, if someone discloses to you, and arguably even if they don't disclose to you, you have to offer reasonable adjustments. Now, reasonable is another one of those grey words. What's reasonable? What's not reasonable? Who knows? I often tell companies that reasonable is anything that doesn't impact health and safety or something that doesn't put the organization at a significant financial risk. For instance, you need a whole wall knocking down and your own office built, probably unreasonable. You need a quiet space so you can work once an hour to use like your voice software, reasonable. It's all about that. Maybe you work in a retail industry and you want to work at home. You can't work at home, you have to be there. But let's say you work on an office job, working at home, no problem. This is changes in work conditions, equipment, duties, or hours. This is a discussion because some employers are scared of adjustments. They think that there'll be like a uprising of everyone demanding, like lesser hours or less duties, when there isn't data to prove that. The adjustment should allow someone to be able to do their job should they have medical or additional needs. For instance, your ADHD is making one task a bit more challenging. A reasonable adjustment should be able to ease some of that pressure off to allow you to do your job. This is essentially what we mean by the social model, because rather than saying you're wrong, do something about it, what this is saying is actually society's the problem. We haven't created things for you, and now we are going to retrospectively refit things to make it more accessible. This isn't universal design, but this is us doing the next best thing in order to make sure that yesterday's mistakes aren't influencing additional friction. Oh, Tracy says, I'm struggling to get 2 pieces of software and a headset. It only costs 1,600 for a company that turns over 1,200 million. See, that is stingy, Tracy. What would I say to that? I think you'd have to, first of all, for a company that makes that amount of money, I imagine they would have like occupational therapist. I would recommend going through Access to Work. Again, it's about building up that narrative, because I would want to see direct emails that they said, no, you cannot have this, then for them to explain why you cannot have this. I would also, from your perspective, not just justify why you need it because you can't do something, but justify why it would be beneficial and how it would help you be more productive in your work. I don't think you should have to fight for these things. Sometimes I think if you can reposition something in a more of a positive light, it can help it go across. Quite often with these big companies, you think they are loaded with money. They are loaded with money, but they ring fence the money, and the money is very difficult to access. I've worked with some of the most richest companies in the world, and they have no budget to do anything because the budget is ring fenced in very small little pockets. For them to expand that budget, very difficult. Still, no excuse. Oh, you have an access to work application and process. Absolutely. That was the reason Access to Work, which is a government grant for workplace needs assessment, was created in the first place. It was to say, hey, no be pulling on the I've got no money card. Everyone should be entitled to adjustments. Personally, I think really rich companies shouldn't use the service and they should pay for themselves. But I think this is the most fairest option to make sure it is accessible and open to anyone. Have a look at this lovely image. You might have seen something like this before, quite a common one. What image, left or right, do you think is the most reasonable one? Patricia says, I personally don't have ADHD, but I do influence employers who are employing young people in the workplace. I discuss reasonable adjustments and help the young people understand how to disclose needs. When disclosing ADHD, I take the time to understand what would make the transition into work as seamless as possible, and that it is reasonable to the employer. There is genuinely a middle ground. Is this your experience? Yes, it is. You can go too extreme because I've seen people who have asked for adjustments that are completely unreasonable. I had one person who wanted an electric scooter to get to work each day. No. But I've had someone who just wanted a quiet space to work a couple hours a week. Absolutely reasonable. But is a discussion, whatever the answer is, either for what you want or what the other person is saying yes or no to, you have to explain why. The Equality Act basically states if someone discloses to you, you have to make adjustments, but it doesn't state what adjustments you have to make. So let's say someone says they want something and you're like, that's not reasonable. You can't just say, bye. You must say, okay, we can't do that, but here is a solid, reasonable alternative that we could do. Some people think reasonable is making sure everyone has everything. Everyone's got the same computer. Everyone's got the right equipment. That's fair. But here we can see everyone's got a box. Isn't that fair? No, because we are all born different. Some are tall, some are short, etc. Reasonable adjustments would be making sure that everyone has the same access, which would be like the view or the ability to do something, but the adjustments are tailored for the individual. This seems quite an easy concept to grasp when we're talking about physical disabilities. It's okay, being in a wheelchair, why don't we just give everyone a wheelchair? It wouldn't be useful. But how does we apply that same logic to ND? Everyone has a unique brain types. Everyone will need adjustments, but the adjustments that are offered are different for everyone. This is one of the biggest pitfalls I see companies do. They say, hey, Nat, these workplace needs assessments, they're great and everything, but can you just give me a list and I'll make sure that I can apply this equipment to whoever wants it? How long is a piece of string? There isn't a definitive list what would benefit someone and what wouldn't. This is why we have to keep it quite agile. In the first picture, the youngest child can't see the game. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's look at some actual tribunals. These are real ones, fresh off the press in the last couple of years. They were publicly online. I'm assuming it's fine. Name and shame time. Sorry, Land Rover, but I'm chucking you under the bus. Again, this was online. This is Mr. J Power. What a good name, versus Jaguar Land Rover. Whenever you see these tribunals, I always get this like mental image of a fight. In the left corner, we've got Jaguar. The idea was, the claim was, Mr. Power claimed his ADHD caused violent, aggressive behavior, leading to harassment and discrimination at work. See, they're never that black and white. What do we mean by this? Essentially, the person was being a bit aggressive and people like that behavior isn't going to fly here. I think most of us would agree aggressive behavior is not okay, especially in a professional environment. But then he was like, it's because of my ADHD. Because of my ADHD, I struggle with depression, and my depression makes me more irritable and I get less sleep, and it puts me in a position where I'm more likely to have aggression. So already we're muddying the waters a little bit. The judgment dismissed disability discrimination, ruling ADHD didn't significantly impact his daily activities. While ADHD does count as a disability, there is a scale. For instance, you can't say it impacts every element of your life. If you were just plain rude and obnoxious and not being great, I don't know if this person was being that way, by the way, you can't just say it's not your get out of jail free card. It's not always going to rule in your favor. The impact was Mr. Power managed symptoms with coping mechanisms like listening to music. That was a reasonable adjustment. Being able to regulate one's emotion and finding a way that works for them job done. ADHD did not meet the criteria for a disability under the Equality Act 2010 during the relevant period. This is, again, while ADHD is for life, it's a disability. For instance, would you say Elon Musk, who has autism, is disabled? He's one of the richest people on the planet. Maybe not. A disability is something that puts you at a significant disadvantage for a long, ongoing period of time. If someone was currently managing their symptoms because they had mechanisms in place, maybe that wouldn't be counted as a disability. This is why I always say conditions like ADHD and autism, they are disabling by society and not inherently a disability. Depending on what processes, systems you have in place would back up the whether or not something counts as a disability. Yeah, emotional deregulation, like, it is definitely is a battle. These things, did ADHD play a part in it? Yes, but it didn't play enough of a part. They ruled that it would recount as the person was dismissed unfairly. Whether you agree with this or not, you let me know. Okay, the question I'm going to ask to you, what do you think an employer's duty to reasonable adjustment should be? What is the absolute minimal requirement they can do to be inclusive? And where should they be doing? You've got the legal thing and you've got the moral aspect. All right, we got do the right thing morally. I'm going to question you on that. What's right? What's moral? I guess it depends what big book you read, which tells you what your moralities are. Are we going by the 10 Commandments? Are we going by what the law says is right or wrong? Hold frank conversations with people who need them to do the best it is possible to do, regardless of the internal policies. Yep, often you need a real strong advocate. That's why I often say managers can be inclusive, organizations rarely are. Open dialogue. We've got doing all they can to put the employer on the same playing field as a neurotypical. Yeah, remember, it's not just about one box. It's about, okay, what do we need in order to allow you to do your job effectively, just like all of your peers? Just listening to managers when they are giving feedback about their employees. Yep, I think managers know their employees better than anyone. What if my ADHD isn't severe enough to be a disability? This is a tricky one because we've all agreed that ADHD is for life. If you have it, you always have it. But we also know that it can affect you in different places in your life. We also know that, like most things, it is a spectrum. Though I personally don't like using severity as labels, high functioning, low functioning, severe, not severe, people use those terms. How do we know if it's not severe enough? Employers should offer support if required. Now, if required, normally means if someone discloses. If someone says, hey, I could do with support, an employer definitely should give them support. But on the other hand, if an employer can visibly see someone is struggling, they should also give support. You don't always need a disclosure in order to offer adjustments. That's why a lot of people just say, if they don't disclose to me, should I even give them support? Absolutely. There is even a legal case to be said for that as well. Failure is a breach of trust and confidence. Now, this is a very kind of fluffy word because who cares? But in terms of creating a good office culture, very important. Constructive dismissal may be claimed. If someone feels that they were dismissed and no adjustments were made to support them, regardless of if they diagnosed, you might have someone in your team who has never disclosed, but they are struggling, and you phone them up, Dave, hate to break it to you, mate, you're fired. They could still say unfair dismissal because no adjustments were made in order to rectify any potential challenges. The employer, while they may not be breaking the Equality Act 2010, they could still be in breach of other laws such as health and safety and well-being. Do know that just because one thing might not be covered, a lot of the time people might look in multiple angles. Let's look at another case because these are some really good ones. We've got the employment case of Ms. Saini versus Community Infosource. The issue was the disability status, determining if Ms. Saini ADHD qualifies as a disability. Because ADHD isn't directly put in as 100% a disability, often you do need to have a discussion about it. They'll look at a number of factors. Now, if you have said to an organization you feel discriminated as a direct result of ADHD, this is normally what the other side will be like bringing up. Is it a disability in this particular instance? The ruling was Miss Saini is considered disabled under the Equality Act. There are many examples where ADHD is absolutely covered. There are some instances where it is not, but it normally comes down to whether or not something met the threshold, like in the previous case. You couldn't put someone's bad temperament on the ADHD in that instance. But in this particular example, absolutely covered. They were diagnosed with ADHD in 2022. Ms. Saini's symptoms significantly affected her daily tasks. She was found credible. What this means is they struggled a lot, but you have to be able to prove up a narrative or a story. I would imagine that they had said it, they had written emails, they had testimonies of other people in the organization saying that they were good at their job. That is a big thing. There's no one else saying the opposite to you, leading to the conclusion that her ADHD substantially and long-term impacted her daily life. This is what we mean by a disability. Does something affect you for a long time significantly? Some days something might be disabling, but it doesn't mean it's a disability. If something is disabling for a prolonged period of time, that's when you've got a disability. That is exactly why you can have ADHD and have a disability, and you can have ADHD and arguably not have a disability. But she absolutely met the criteria. The key points to take away from this is duties to consider reasonable adjustments exist before a diagnosis is fixed. It doesn't matter if someone is diagnosed or not diagnosed, you have to do adjustments. If someone gets a diagnosis afterwards and you say you didn't have it at the time when you were discriminated against, no, but you're still in the wrong. Everyone is entitled to adjustments. And if someone discloses, then you absolutely have to give adjustments. So all that does is adding kind of more gravitas to your kind of case study or your kind of a portfolio of evidence. But from the very beginning, adjustments are for everyone. It is unacceptable to require an employee to avoid parts of their role to bypass making adjustments. Let's say you have dyslexia. Oh, you struggle at reading. All right, no more reading jobs for you. Not allowed. Have ADHD or any job that requires you to be attentive for hours at a time, you're not doing that. Often I speak with people who said, my role used to be like this. Then they saw I was struggling. So rather than support me in my role, they cut it down more and more. Now I'm only doing a fragment of what I was initially signed up to do. Not okay. One of my ex-employers made me have a new assessment. While they were waiting for that, they moved me sideways to the phones. Yeah, that is absolutely not allowed. Moving people sideways, cutting parts out of the role is discrimination. Adjustments have to be made, and you have to have a discussion about it first. They can't just move the problem along. I'm facing potential downgrading jobs. Yeah, and that's the thing, Tracy. It does start off like that. You have a big role, you're struggling with it. Rather than support you with it, they cut it down. And then they're like, really, what are we paying you for? You're not doing that much. Then we can reduce your hours. Companies aren't firing people, downgrading people is really difficult, but they can do it if they build up a narrative. And that is exactly what they do. They build up a narrative over time, and you've got to just keep an eye on it. I'm not trying to scare everyone. Well, maybe I'm trying to scare you. It's a real thing, though, and I think it's worth knowing about. They have rebranded my job and tried to make me reapply, at which point I put in a grievance. I don't like that at all. That honestly does sound like they are covering their own backsides into kind of pushing you out of the company slowly. I have been on boards for previous roles and jobs. I've been in very senior positions. I tell you, this isn't a conspiracy. People genuinely do try and push people out of roles. Be mindful. But if you think that's happening for you, your word isn't good enough. You do have to build up that narrative. Yes, textbook constructive dismissal. They're swines. Oh, okay, we've got some more comments, which I think are quite interesting. I was only diagnosed last year, but back in 2020, I was struggling a lot and I started therapy and I told my manager about it. After a couple of months, she put me in a performance review and then fired. She put me through months of hell. It's one of the reasons if someone goes on long-term sick leave, you can't fire them while they're on sick leave. It would be case and blank discrimination. We got lack of reasonable adjustments is causing me to take on roles below my pay grade and could potentially leave me, resulting in a massive pay cut. If there is elements of your role that you aren't able to do, adjustments should be the first port of call. When adjustments are offered, best practice says that about 3 months to see if those adjustments are effective or not before making a follow-up discussion. So let's say you're struggling. They put you on a performance plan. They give you adjustments. they have to wait at least 3 months in order to make a decision on what to do with you. A lot of the time, people just go, all right, you haven't made any improvements. You only gave me my software yesterday. I can't improve overnight. Steve says, okay, great talk. Many of the points are resonating with me. I have never been promoted in any job, and I am a few years off 50. I have been in the same job 14 years, produced a high volume of technical engineering and scientific work, but still no promotion. New starters and staff in other teams are surprised when they discover my junior grade. I enjoy completing the interesting work. However, I can be frustrated and bemused by the lack of progression, which on occasion can feel and raise feelings of resentment, although this is overridden by the company otherwise being a great place to work with many fascinating opportunities and respected experts to collaborate with. Promoting is a challenge as I would need to produce the same amount of work in less time as we use hourly consultation models, as time management is not my strong point, but holistic thinking and entrepreneurialism is. They aren't looking at the wider picture on what you're able to bring to the team. But I like what you said, how it isn't all bad. The organization is pretty good on the whole. And that's because life's not black and white. You could say, I could leave the company, but am I going to find a company that is as good as this one? If the role you applied for was very particular, maybe, but I would say you'd have to have exhausted all other options first, such as having one-to-ones, such as performance plans, such as workplace needs assessments, such as occupational therapies. There's lots of things they have to do in advance before they can make a snap decision. Remember, it's all about building a narrative. When you look at tribunals, people have evidence to back it up. We're almost there. Now, to end off with, what are the challenges for employees with ADHD? What is the key problem here? Not just like, what is the issue with ADHD, but what are the key challenges of having ADHD as an employee? Misunderstanding. Yep. Communication challenges is by far one of the biggest deficits. Lack of awareness. Yes. Lack of understanding, self-advocating. Yep. Let's face it. A lot of us are quite detrimental to ourselves. We're not exactly bigging ourselves up. Lack of clear expectations. Yep. If people are expecting us to perform in a neurotypical way, everyone's going to be disappointed. But when we change the parameters of what success looks by the person's unique abilities, that's when we're probably going to get a more of a balanced playing field. Shutting up, blunt, but yeah, it's about reading the room. Absolutely. Let's look at one more example of a discrimination case before we finish up for the day, because I think this one's quite interesting. This is one that was done against Hammersmith and Fulham Council. I'm going to be making enemies today, but be fair, this is all online, so easy to get to. The issue was a person informed an employer of ADHD, completed health assessments, and discussed conditions. Someone was struggling. They were completely transparent, completely open, disclosed, nice and simple. However, as a result, the person took sick leave due to a mental health breakdown, which again was heavily related to ADHD burnout. The probation extended without feedback. Probation is that kind of safety net. Once you pass probation, it's really difficult to fire you. But when you're in probation, it's easy to get rid of someone. However, you can't extend a probation without having that chat with someone. If this happens to you, know that they can't just extend a probation. You have to have a discussion. The role was then terminated during sick leave. You can't do that, definitely without a discussion. The two things here for me, this was a very simple one. Sometimes it's not easy. This one is clear. The findings was the council failed to comply with ACAS. ACAS is like the regulatory body of HR. And they looked at it and they were like, you know what? You are wrong here. Open and shut case on the most part. We've looked at a case where someone has failed because they didn't meet the criteria for discrimination. We looked at one where they did. There's a little bit of wiggle room. Could have went either way. Now we've looked at one where absolutely no complaints. So if you ever do think you're being discriminated against, do know that you do have a legal right to be represented and to get help. Getting legal advice is beneficial because a legal expert would know how likely you are for success. This isn't a process which I'd recommend for anyone to go through unless they really felt it was worthwhile, because it can be very stressful. When I was 19, I was fired while off sick, just inside my 13-week period. Yep, that was definitely not allowed. If I'd known I was ND, I would have really had that company. I think a lot of people find out when it's too late. Then I don't know if there's like what's that thing when you wait too long? Statute of limitations. I don't know if that's an American thing or not, but there's like a similar process where there's not, Emma, you can do it at any time.
We don't have the statute of limitations. In some cases, there is no cut-off for past prosecution, but you can't apply a law retroactively. It depends if the law was the law at the time, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
So you couldn't prosecute everyone now for not wearing seatbelts in the 70s. Do you get what I mean? But if something was illegal 10 years ago, you can still be done for it now.
There's loads of things that America has ruined my understanding of the British law system. But anyway, do you have any comments on ADHD comorbidity with autism, Asperger's and dyslexia, including all the combinations? Is this the norm or the exception? Yeah, Steve, co-occurrence is absolutely the norm. I've never met someone who only has one thing. It's because diagnoses it's all over the place. We label people because it gives us a starting point. This is why I think in our legal system, we do not say this is a disability because there are too many variations and our understanding is moving a lot all the time. All right, should duties be withheld because they have ADHD? Fingers crossed, we know this one. No, there may be things you don't want to do or unable to do, but it shouldn't be done automatically. Everything should be a discussion. We want a job. We want to contribute to society. I wouldn't want it if people took all my work away. I still want my work, but I want work that works with me rather than against me. Final thing to end on is what tips would you give employers that are managing ADHD employees? For those of us who have been discriminated against, if we could say one or two things, what would we say to them? Bear in mind, most employers are actually really nice people, but it often comes down to ignorance or a lack of understanding. All right, we've got listening. We've got talk to the employee, find out their needs. Because as this little image shows, the way ADHD manifests can look different in anyone. Normally, is ADHD the reason why you're being bad at your job? No. But it might be the depression that comes as a result of it can make work more challenging. Could be the social interaction. It might be that you're more likely to hurt yourself. You're off a bit more. The complex behaviors. Maybe that person who did have anger management challenges potentially did have a case. But as you can see, it can't always be clear cut because the system has to be robust. Take part in neurodiversity awareness courses, absolutely. Give team training on working with and being aware of needs of others. My top tips is all people with ADHD are different. One size does not fit all. Dialogue is important, have it. An employer should assume it is under legal duty to make reasonable adjustments. Always assume. There's too many little loopholes. 9 times out of 10, always assume that you are under a legal duty to make reasonable adjustments. Do not say, I think you have that or you don't have that. Never say someone doesn't have something. You don't know them. It's not for you to say whether someone does or doesn't need help. If they say they need it, even if they say they don't need it, you should still offer. Provide training for other staff about ADHD awareness. Do not put the emphasis on the ND individual. Remember, this isn't a them problem. It's a societal problem. We must support the whole workforce in better understanding, not just the individual. Otherwise, we're penalizing the individual for being born differently. As we said, dialogue is absolutely crucial. We all think differently. We all have different cultures. We can't really pigeonhole people. ADHD may not even be a diagnosis in a few years' time because our understanding changes. It might be merged into autism. What isn't going to change is the fact that people think differently. That is something that is always going to be around. If you think you may have ADHD and you're like, I don't know, you could check out our neurodiversity tests and quizzes online. They aren't scientific, okay? They're based on scientific research, but they're more of a fun test to understand the characteristics, symptoms, to help you better understand. Any questions whatsoever on ADHD discrimination, any points you want to share, now is your time and space. Our next webinar, I believe it is the history of developmental coordination disorder, aka dyspraxia. We're going to be looking at a deep dive in the history. Where did it come from? Why did we change the names? Who says what about when? Same time every single week at Thursday at 12 till 1. Thank you everyone so much for attending today. I really appreciate you all. Fingers crossed, I'll see you again next week. All right, cheers everyone. Have a good rest of your day.